Elara lived on the fringes of town, her small, weathered farmhouse a quiet sentinel against the sprawling fields. Most folk saw a woman stooped slightly by age, her hands gnarled from years spent coaxing life from stubborn soil. They saw faded denim and practical boots, a face etched with time, often turned towards the horizon with an expression they mistook for simple weariness. They didn't see the steel in her spine that no amount of physical labor could bend. They didn't see the eyes, faded blue like a well-worn flag, that missed nothing, cataloging details with an unconscious, lethal efficiency. Her life was quiet now, a deliberate cultivation of peace after decades spent immersed in the world's sharpest edges. The silence of the countryside was a balm, the predictable rhythm of seasons a welcome change from the chaotic, unpredictable violence that had once been her daily bread. She kept to herself, visiting the general store for supplies, exchanging polite, brief pleasantries, and otherwise remaining a fixture of the landscape, unremarkable and easily overlooked. She found a certain solace in this invisibility. It allowed her to simply be, without the weight of command or the constant vigilance that had defined her past. She grew tomatoes that tasted like summer sunshine, raised chickens that laid eggs with rich, orange yolks, and spent evenings reading by the glow of a single lamp, the silence broken only by the distant howl of a coyote or the creak of her old house settling. This peace, so carefully built, felt fragile at times, like spun glass. A sudden loud noise, a car backfiring, could still send a jolt through her, a ghost of adrenaline in her veins. The quiet was deliberate, but it was also a form of armor. An attempt to keep the outside world, the world she knew too well, at bay. She had seen the worst of humanity, faced down monsters in places the maps didn't bother to name, and carried the weight of impossible decisions. Retreating to this small corner of the world wasn't cowardice, it was survival. But even in this quiet corner, shadows were beginning to lengthen. A new element had arrived in town, a ripple of unease disturbing the still surface of rural life. They called themselves the Vultures, and the name was apartment. They circled the vulnerable, picking at the edges of legitimate businesses, preying on fear. They were loud, their vehicles souped up and roaring through streets that were usually quiet by dusk. They wore matching patches, displayed crude tattoos, and carried an aura of casual menace that intimidated the peace-loving residents. Their leader was a man named Rex, a hulking figure whose face seemed permanently set in a sneer. He wasn't smart, not in any meaningful way, but he understood brute force and intimidation. He had a corps of lieutenants, equally unpleasant, equally thuggish, who enforced his will with threats and violence. They started small, demanding protection money from the diner owner, vandalizing the gas station when the elderly proprietor refused to pay. The local sheriff, a decent man named Miller, was overwhelmed and outmatched. His small department was designed for domestic disputes and lost hikers, not organized thuggery. Rex and his vultures represented a level of organized crime the town had never experienced, and they exploited that lack of preparation mercilessly. Fear began to spread like a sickness. Storefronts were boarded up earlier, people avoided going out after dark, and a hushed tension settled over coffee shop conversations. The vultures didn't just want money, they seemed to relish the fear they instilled, the power it gave them over the town's spirit. They swaggered down Main Street as if they owned it, their laughter echoing ominously. They were a predator introduced into a timid flock, and they were enjoying the hunt. Elara observed this from her quiet distance. She saw the fear in the eyes of the people at the store, heard the hushed whispers. She felt the familiar, unwelcome stir of old instincts, buried deep but not dead. Her peace felt threatened not just for herself, but for the simple, good people around her. It reminded her of places she had seen before, places where the weak were preyed upon, and silence was mistaken for consent. She tried, at first, to tell herself it wasn't her fight. She had done her time, paid her dues, carried her burdens. She deserved this peace. But the unease grew, a knot tightening in her stomach. The vultures were a disease, and they would consume the town if left unchecked. The quiet life was a luxury she might not be able to afford if it meant letting predators feast on innocence. She watched them, learning their patterns, their habits, their weaknesses. The old gears, the ones she thought were rusted shut, began to turn again, slow but sure. The quiet farmer was watching, and the predator was about to become the prey. The incident that shattered the fragile peace was small in scale but immense in its impact. It happened at Miller's Gas and Go, the only gas station for 20 miles, owned by an elderly couple, the Millers, who had been in the town longer than anyone could remember. Elara was there, filling her old truck, the late afternoon sun casting long shadows. A black pickup truck, modified with lifted suspension and oversized tires, roared into the lot, spitting gravel. 4 vultures piled out, led by Rex's second-in-command, a man named Spike. Spike was leaner than Rex but had a viperous quickness and a cruel glint in his eye. The Millers, a frail man and a woman with a perpetual tremor, stood behind the counter inside the small convenience store. Spike sauntered in, his boots loud on the worn linoleum. The other 3 vultures loitered by the door, radiating menace. Elara finished pumping gas, watching the scene through the greasy window with a stillness that belied the sudden, cold clarity flooding her mind. This wasn't observation anymore, this was assessment. Spike slammed his hand on the counter, making the old bell jingle violently. "All right, Gramps," Spike snarled, "time to pay up." Old man Miller, his face pale, shook his head. "We told you, Spike. We don't have it. We barely make enough to keep the lights on as it is." Spike leaned in, his voice dropping to a dangerous hiss. "Wrong answer, old man. Rex says you pay, or things get messy." He swept a hand across the counter, sending a display of gum and candy crashing to the floor. Mrs. Miller cried out, a small, reedy sound of fear. Spike laughed, a harsh, grating sound. "Maybe we start breaking things. Or maybe, we break people." He grabbed the old man by the collar, lifting him slightly off his feet. Elara stepped inside, the screen door closing softly behind her. The vultures by the door barely glanced at her, dismissing the elderly woman in overalls. She walked towards the counter, her movements slow and deliberate. Spike didn't notice her at first, too focused on terrorizing the Millers. "Let him go," Elara said, her voice quiet, level, cutting through the tension like a razor. Spike turned, dropping old man Miller, who stumbled back, gasping. Spike looked Elara up and down, a smirk spreading across his face. Well, what have we here? Grandma wants to play hero?" The vultures by the door chuckled. Spike took a step towards her, puffing out his chest. "Beat it, old lady. This ain't your business." Elara met his gaze, her eyes steady. The subtle shift in her posture, the way her hands hung loosely at her sides, went unnoticed by Spike and his crew. But the air around her changed, grew still and charged. "It is now," she said. Spike's smirk vanished, replaced by annoyance. He raised a fist. "You want to get hurt?" In that instant, Elara moved. Not with speed that defied age, but with a terrifying efficiency born of instinct and perfect timing. Her foot swept out, low and fast, hooking Spike's ankle. As he started to fall forward, she delivered a short, sharp strike to his jaw with the heel of her hand. It wasn't a punch, it was a directed force, leveraging his own momentum. Spike hit the floor like a sack of rocks, eyes wide with shock and pain before they rolled back in his head. He was out cold. The other 3 vultures froze, their chuckles dying instantly. They looked at Spike on the floor, then at Elara, their faces a mixture of disbelief and confusion. Elara didn't hesitate. She was already moving towards the nearest thug, who was fumbling for something in his jacket. He was young, maybe 20, scared and slow. She closed the distance in 2 steps, her hand blurring as it chopped down on his wrist. A sickening crack echoed in the small store. He roared in pain, dropping a switchblade. Before he could recover, she spun, using his body as momentary cover as the third thug lunged. He was bigger, slower. Elara sidestepped, letting his momentum carry him past her, then used her shoulder to drive him into a shelf of canned goods. Cans clattered everywhere. As he reeled, she delivered a precise knee strike to his solar plexus. He doubled over, gagging. The last thug, the biggest of the four, finally got his wits about him and charged. He swung wildly. Elara swayed back, letting the blow whistle past her ear. Then, in one fluid motion, she grabbed his arm, twisted, and drove her elbow into his bicep nerve point. His arm went instantly numb. With his guard broken, she moved in, a series of rapid, controlled strikes, temple, kidney, base of the skull. He crumpled to the floor, unconscious before he hit the ground. It was over in perhaps 15 seconds. Silence returned, broken only by the gasping breaths of the millers and the low groans from the pile of vultures on the floor. Elara stood in the middle of the chaos, her chest rising and falling evenly. Her face was calm, but the faded blue eyes held a chilling intensity the millers had never seen. Spike groaned, stirring. Elara glanced at him. "Get up," she said, her voice still quiet, but now carrying an unmistakable authority. Spike, his head throbbing, looked up at her with dawning horror. He scrambled to his feet, looking at his unconscious men. What are you?" he stammered. Elara didn't answer the question. "Tell Rex," she said, her voice low and dangerous, "tell him he just made a mistake. This town isn't his. Not anymore." Spike, seeing something in her eyes that chilled him to the bone, didn't argue. He grabbed the conscious thugs, dragged them out, and piled them into the pickup truck. He drove away fast, leaving a trail of dust and stunned silence. Old Man Miller sank onto a stool, trembling. Mrs. Miller just stared at Elara, her eyes wide and tearful. "Elara," she whispered, "what, how?" Elara gave them a small, weary smile. "Just helping neighbors, Martha." She bent down, picking up a scattered pack of gum, her movements those of an old woman again, yet subtly different now. The Millers knew, the vultures knew, and soon, the whole town would know. The unassuming farmer had teeth. And she wasn't afraid to use them. Spike's return to the vultures' makeshift headquarters, a derelict warehouse on the edge of town, was anything but triumphant. He practically shoved his groaning, injured men through the door before stumbling in himself, his face bruised and pale. Rex was sprawled on a worn sofa, drinking beer and playing cards with two other vultures. He looked up, annoyed. "What the hell happened to you?" Rex demanded, his voice a low rumble. Spike flinched. Rex, it was the old lady." Rex scowled. "What old lady? The one at the gas station?" "Yeah," Spike rasped, touching his sore jaw. She took us all down. Like it was nothing. Broke Kev's wrist, knocked out the others. It happened so fast." Rex stared at him, disbelief warring with anger. "You're telling me some old granny in overalls kicked your ass? All four of you?" "I swear, Rex. She ain't just some old lady. She moves, weird. And her eyes, they're cold, Rex. Real cold." Spike relayed Elara's message, his voice trembling slightly. She said this town isn't yours. Not anymore." A vein throbbed on Rex's temple. Humiliation and fury boiled inside him. His top enforcer, beaten by an old woman? It was an insult he couldn't tolerate. It made him look weak in front of his men. "An old woman?" Rex repeated, his voice dangerously low. "An old woman did this? This is unacceptable." He stood up, towering over Spike. "You idiots. You let some ancient broad make fools of you." He paced the warehouse floor, his mind churning. This wasn't just about money anymore. It was about respect. It was about sending a message. No one challenged Rex and got away with it. Especially not some seemingly fragile old woman from the outskirts. He slammed his fist into a nearby table, making the cards jump. "Find out who she is," Rex ordered. "Everything about her. Where she lives, who she knows. She thinks she can waltz in and tell me what to do. She's about to learn how wrong she is." He grinned, a cruel, predatory baring of teeth. Maybe this old lady needs to learn a lesson. A painful 1 inch. His gaze fell on Spike and the injured men. "And you losers are gonna be useful for something. You're gonna help me make an example." The air in the warehouse grew thick with dark intent. Rex's overconfidence hadn't been diminished by Spike's account, it had been amplified by rage. He didn't see a formidable opponent, he saw an anomaly, an affront to his authority that needed to be crushed publicly and brutally. He vastly underestimated the depth of Elara's capabilities and the consequences of pushing someone who had nothing left to lose but her peace and the safety of those around her. The vultures began making discreet inquiries, asking locals questions about Elara, pretending casual curiosity that thinly veiled their menace. Most people, intimidated, offered little information, reinforcing Elara's reputation as a quiet, reclusive figure. But Sheriff Miller, hearing about the incident at the gas station and witnessing the fear it had both instilled and, paradoxically, punctured, started his own quiet investigation into Elara's background. He was a good man, but cautious, constrained by procedure and limited resources. He knew the vultures were trouble, but he also knew charging in headfirst would only get his deputies hurt and make things worse for the town. He ran Elara's name through the system, finding almost nothing publicly available. No criminal record, no significant financial history. It was almost as if she didn't exist before she bought the farm 20 years ago. This lack of information, instead of reassuring him, set off alarm bells. People didn't just appear out of nowhere with no trace. Meanwhile, Elara wasn't idle. She didn't need to investigate the vultures, their methods were textbook low-level organized crime. Intimidation, extortion, establishing dominance through violence. What she needed was information about their structure, their numbers, their connections, and their vulnerabilities. She started small, observing their movements at night, noting their routines. Her old skills, honed over decades in hostile environments, resurfaced effortlessly. Surveillance, pattern recognition, risk assessment. She blended into the background, a shadow in the night, watching the warehouse from a distance. She identified their key lieutenants, estimated their total numbers at around 20 to 25, a significant force for a town this size. She saw a steady stream of vehicles coming and going at odd hours, suggesting more than just local thuggery, perhaps drug trafficking or stolen goods. The stakes were higher than just protecting the Millers. This was about cutting out a cancerous growth before it consumed the entire town. She also started thinking about allies. She knew she couldn't take on Rex and his 20-plus thugs alone, not without risking unacceptable collateral damage. She needed people who understood this kind of fight. People who weren't afraid. Her thoughts drifted back to a life she had left behind, a brotherhood forged in fire and blood. There was a motorcycle club in a nearby state, the Iron Sentinels. Not a criminal gang, but a group of veterans, many of them former special operations, who found camaraderie and purpose on the road and in helping fellow vets and their communities. Their president, a man known only as Ghost, was someone Elara had served with, someone she trusted implicitly. A call would cost her the anonymity she cherished, but the cost of inaction was far greater. Simultaneously, Sheriff Miller, hitting a wall in his digital search for Elara, decided to try a different approach. He visited Old Man Miller at the gas station. The old man, though still shaken, recounted the event, his voice filled with awe as he described Elara's sudden, almost supernatural efficiency. "Sheriff," he'd said, his eyes wide, "she ain't normal. The way she moved, it wasn't like someone her age. It was like watching lightning. This confirmed Miller's suspicion. He decided to visit Elara. He found her in her garden, wearing wide-brimmed hat and work gloves, looking every bit the unassuming farmer. She greeted him calmly, offering him iced tea. He sat on her porch, the quiet hum of insects the only sound. He talked about the incident, about the vultures, about his concerns for the town. Elara listened, her expression unreadable. Finally, she spoke. "Sheriff," she said, her voice soft, "the vultures are a problem your department isn't equipped to handle. They're organized. They're ruthless. And they're connected." "How do you know that, Elara?" Miller asked, his gaze steady. Elara paused, looking out at her fields. She had a choice. Maintain the facade, or bring a potential ally into her confidence. She decided to risk it. "Because I've dealt with groups like them before, Sheriff," she said, turning to face him. The hat couldn't hide the look in her eyes now. It was the same cold, assessing gaze Spike had described. A long time ago. In a different life. She didn't offer details, and Miller, sensing the deep, unspoken history behind her words, didn't press. "I saw what you did at the gas station, Elara," he admitted. "I reviewed the security footage. It wasn't normal." "I'm not a normal old lady, Sheriff," Elara stated plainly. "I can help you," Miller said, his voice determined. "I might not have the manpower for a full-scale assault, but I have the badge, I have access to information, and I have good people on my force who are sick of being pushed around." Elara studied him for a long moment. She saw courage in his eyes, integrity in his bearing. He wasn't elite, but he was dedicated and he cared about his town. He could be useful. "All right, Sheriff Miller," Elara said, a hint of something that might have been respect in her tone. "Then let's talk." Their conversation that afternoon was the beginning of an unlikely alliance. Meanwhile, Rex, consumed by his need for revenge and determined to reassert his dominance, wasn't waiting. He sent his vultures on a series of escalating acts of intimidation. They vandalized the town square gazebo, broke windows of businesses that had refused to pay, and roughed up a few young men who had dared to stand up to them. They firebombed a small, unoccupied shed near the edge of town as a warning. The message was clear: defiance would not be tolerated. Fear intensified. The initial burst of hope inspired by Elara's action at the gas station began to waver under the relentless pressure. People started whispering that maybe it was better just to pay, to appease the vultures and make them leave. Rex wanted the town to break, and he was applying maximum pressure. He believed the old woman was just a momentary anomaly, a fluke. He believed the townspeople were weak. He was about to make another catastrophic miscalculation. Sheriff Miller left Elara's farmhouse later that evening, his mind reeling. The quiet farmer had revealed just enough of her past, through carefully chosen words and the stark, chilling efficiency he'd seen on the security footage, for him to understand he was dealing with someone truly extraordinary. Not just skilled, but lethal. He had asked about her background explicitly, and she had answered with a controlled brevity that spoke volumes. "I served," she'd said, her gaze distant for a moment. "Operations. For a long time. Saw a lot. Did a lot." He didn't need to know the specifics, the unit names, the locations. The way she carried herself, the way her eyes constantly scanned, the absolute lack of hesitation in her movements against Spike and his men, it all screamed highly trained. More than that, it screamed survivalist. Someone who had lived and thrived in the most dangerous environments imaginable. Someone who knew how to kill with terrifying effectiveness. Sheriff Miller returned to his office, the conversation replaying in his head. He pulled up the security footage again, watching Elara's swift, brutal takedown of the vultures. The way she moved, the targets of her strikes, the clinical precision, it wasn't street fighting. It was something else entirely. He decided to reach out to a contact he had at the state level, an old friend who had served in the military before joining the state police. He described Elara, her apparent age, her skills as seen on the footage, and the strange lack of background information. His contact listened intently. "Sheriff, what you're describing sounds like deep cover or something classified. People who operate at that level usually have their official records scrubbed clean." He agreed to make a few discreet inquiries through unofficial channels, leveraging his connections in the military intelligence community. Within 2 days, he called Miller back. His voice was hushed. "Sheriff, I can't give you names or specific details. It's classified. But, the description you gave me, age, gender, skill set, it matches the profile of a handful of individuals involved in highly sensitive operations decades ago." He paused. "These weren't soldiers, Sheriff. These were assets. Operatives who went into the darkest places and did the dirtiest jobs. They were the best of the best. Untraceable. Untouchable." Miller felt a chill run down his spine. "Are you saying Elara is one of them?" "The profile fits," his contact confirmed. "If she is, Sheriff, those vultures have no idea who they're messing with. She wouldn't just be a skilled fighter. She'd be a ghost. A strategist. A force of nature they couldn't possibly comprehend." He offered a final, grave warning. "These people, they're designed to win. At any cost. If she's decided to fight, Rex and his boys are already dead, they just don't know it yet. Get out of her way, Sheriff, or work with her. But don't try to stop her." Sheriff Miller knew then that the quiet farmer was far more than he could have ever imagined. He understood the stakes had just been raised beyond anything the town had ever faced. This wasn't just about local crime anymore. This was about a hidden war veteran re-engaging her formidable skills to protect her home. And he was on her side. He drove back to Elara's farmhouse, this time with a clearer understanding of who she truly was. He found her sharpening a large hunting knife on a whetstone, her movements practiced and calm. She looked up as he approached, a faint smile touching her lips. "Find out what you needed to know, Sheriff?" she asked. Miller nodded, sinking into a chair on the porch. "I think I understand," he said, his voice heavy. "More than you probably wanted to know," Elara replied, the edge in her voice softening slightly. "Look, Elara," Miller began, leaning forward. "I know you can handle yourself. But these vultures, they're getting bolder. Rex is angry. He's going to escalate." "I know," Elara said, testing the blade's edge with her thumb. "That's why we need a plan." The word "we" hung in the air. An acknowledgement of their burgeoning alliance. Elara spread a large, faded map of the town and surrounding area on her kitchen table later that evening. Sheriff Miller sat opposite her, along with his most trusted deputy, a no-nonsense woman named Deputy Hanson. Hanson was young but sharp and brave. Elara had observed her during the initial vulture incidents and seen a spark of defiance the others lacked. "Here's what we know," Elara began, her finger tracing lines on the map. "The vultures operate primarily out of the old warehouse here." She pointed to a spot on the map. "Estimated numbers, 20 to 25. They have lookouts, patrols, a relatively loose perimeter. Their strength is intimidation and numbers in a head-on confrontation. Their weakness is discipline and intelligence. They rely on brute force and fear, not tactical thinking." Sheriff Miller added details about known vehicles, individual vultures identified, and what little concrete evidence they had gathered about their activities, mostly minor vandalism reports and extortion attempts, but enough to build a preliminary case. "They're likely involved in more than just petty extortion," Elara stated. "The traffic in and out of the warehouse, the resources Rex seems to have, there's something bigger going on. Drugs, stolen goods, maybe even human trafficking." A cold dread settled in the room. If that's the case, Deputy Hansen said, her voice tight, this is way beyond a local gang problem. Exactly, Elara agreed. We need to hit them hard, hit them fast, and hit them where it hurts the most. We can't just arrest them for vandalism. We need to expose their core operation and dismantle them completely. How do we do that? Miller asked. We use their weaknesses against them, Elara explained, her eyes alight with strategic thought. We don't go in guns blazing. That's what they expect. That's where they have the advantage in numbers. We use precision, surprise, and leverage their own arrogance. She outlined a multi-phased plan. Phase 1, intelligence gathering. We need confirmation on what they're moving, where it comes from, and who they're connected to. We need to find their stash, their records, anything that links them definitively to major crimes. How do we get that? Hansen asked. Surveillance, Elara replied. Close, discreet, and patient. Sheriff, you and your deputies can monitor known associates, watch their movements in town, use your resources to track vehicles. I can handle getting eyes inside the warehouse perimeter. Miller and Hansen exchanged a look. They understood what getting eyes inside meant from Elara. It meant putting herself in danger, relying on the skills they had only glimpsed. Phase 2, Elara continued, ignoring their hesitation, is disrupting their operation. Small, targeted strikes that cause chaos and make Rex paranoid. Make him think his own people are unreliable. Make him pull back, expose himself. Like what? Miller asked. Anonymous tips to surrounding county sheriffs about stolen cars they're moving, Elara suggested. Minor sabotage that looks like internal squabbling, disabling a vehicle, tampering with a delivery that goes unreported to the police. Things that cost them money and make them distrust each other. We can manage the anonymous tips, Hansen said, already thinking. Subtle sabotage, that would be you, wouldn't it? Miller stated. Elara gave a small nod. Phase 3, leverage. Once we have enough intelligence and they're off balance, we use it to hit their main operation. We isolate Rex, cut off his support, and take away his power base. This was the riskiest part. It involved confronting the core group. This is where we'll need more than just the three of us, Elara stated. Sheriff, you can coordinate with state police or federal agencies once we have concrete proof of larger crimes. But for the initial takedown, we need muscle. Skilled muscle. The Iron Sentinels, Miller realized. Elara nodded. They're veterans. Disciplined. They believe in protecting their communities and standing up to bullies. They won't do anything illegal, but they know how to handle themselves, and they have the resources, transport, communications, sheer numbers, that we lack. Are they reliable? Hansen asked. Absolutely, Elara confirmed. They're my brothers and sisters. They'll be here. They spent hours refining the plan, discussing contingencies, identifying potential problems. Elara's tactical mind was formidable, anticipating Rex's likely reactions, identifying escape routes and choke points around the warehouse. Miller provided crucial local knowledge, and Hansen offered practical insights on coordinating with law enforcement protocols as much as possible. As they planned, Rex was making his major move. Embarrassed and enraged by the gas station incident and the growing whispers of defiance in town, he decided to bring in outside help. His vultures weren't enough for the kind of retribution he wanted, the kind that would crush the town's spirit completely and teach the old woman a lesson she'd never forget. He called his contact in the city, a higher-level player in the organized crime world, explaining the situation with forced nonchalance but underlying fury. Yeah, we got a little pest control problem out here, Rex grunted into the phone. Some locals getting froggy. Need a few extra hands. Professionals. The voice on the other end was cold, efficient. Professionals cost, Rex. And they don't like messy situations. It won't be messy, Rex promised, lying through his teeth. Just need M to lean on a few people. Make an example. Send a message. He requested 5 hardened enforcers from the city, men known for their brutality and effectiveness. This wasn't just about intimidating the town anymore. This was about eliminating threats, starting with the old woman. Bringing in the city enforcers raised the stakes dramatically. These weren't local thugs, these were serious criminals with more experience in violence and less hesitation. This meant the conflict was about to move from a local problem to something far more dangerous. Elara, Miller, and Hansen finished their planning session as dawn approached. They looked at the map, the scribbled notes, the carefully laid out phases. It was audacious, dangerous, and their only real chance. Elara gathered the papers, her expression resolute. This isn't just about stopping Rex, she said, her voice quiet but firm. It's about showing this town that they don't have to live in fear. It's about standing up for what's right, even when it's hard. Sheriff Miller nodded, his fatigue momentarily forgotten. I'm with you, Elara. All the way. Deputy Hansen echoed his sentiment. The commitment was made. They would fight for their town, no matter the cost. And the vultures, bolstered by their new, more dangerous reinforcements, were about to find out that challenging a lion in winter was a fatal mistake. The plan moved into its execution phase. Elara began the delicate work of intelligence gathering. She didn't just watch, she infiltrated the periphery. Moving under the cover of darkness, she used the surrounding woods and derelict structures near the warehouse, leveraging her extensive training in stealth and reconnaissance. She was a ghost, unseen, unheard, a skill honed in environments far more hostile than the edge of a rural American town. She observed shift changes, tracked the number of vultures present at any given time, and identified key entry and exit points. She confirmed the increased presence. Rex now had his core group plus the 5 city enforcers, making his active numbers closer to 30, a significant escalation. From overheard conversations and observation of deliveries, she gathered concrete evidence of a large-scale drug operation centered at the warehouse. This was the leverage they needed, a federal crime that would bring serious attention. Meanwhile, Sheriff Miller and Deputy Hansen used their official channels discreetly. Anonymous tips about suspicious vehicles matching descriptions Elara provided were sent to neighboring county law enforcement. This led to several stops and arrests of lower-level vultures attempting to move smaller drug shipments or stolen goods outside the town. Each disruption, minor on its own, chipped away at Rex's network and sowed distrust within his ranks. Who was leaking the information? Was it internal? Elara added to this by executing small, untraceable acts of sabotage near the warehouse. A delivery truck with inexplicably flat tires, a generator that mysteriously failed for a few hours, tools misplaced or damaged in ways that looked accidental or like petty theft among the vultures. Nothing directly confrontational, but enough to create friction and paranoia. Rex, increasingly frustrated by the disruptions and the lack of anyone to blame, grew more agitated. The city enforcers, cold and professional, weren't impressed by his inability to control the situation. Their presence added tension within the vulture ranks. Rex's arrogance began to curdle into anger and suspicion. He started accusing his own men, leading to internal fights and further disorganization. The town felt the pressure mounting. Rex's retaliation for the disruptions was swift and brutal. Feeling cornered and challenged, he unleashed his vultures, including the new enforcers, on the town itself. It wasn't just vandalism now, it was targeted violence. They firebombed the Miller's gas station, thankfully after hours and causing structural damage but no injuries. They severely beat the owner of the diner who had initially refused to pay, leaving him hospitalized. They drove through residential streets, shooting out windows and shouting threats. The fear that had momentarily lifted after the gas station incident returned tenfold, heavier and more crushing than before. People were terrified to leave their homes. Sheriff Miller and Deputy Hanson responded as best they could, but they were overwhelmed. They made arrests for vandalism and assault, but Rex himself remained untouchable, surrounded by his men in the fortified warehouse. The community was tested. The brutal retaliation threatened to break their spirit entirely. But something unexpected happened. Witnessing the sheer cruelty of Rex's response, seeing their neighbors targeted and hurt, ignited a different kind of fire in some of the townsfolk. The fear was still there, but it was now mixed with righteous anger. Old Man Miller, despite his damaged business, stood outside the charred remnants of his gas station the next day, telling reporters, from the small local paper, that he wouldn't be scared away. The diner owner, speaking from his hospital bed, vowed to rebuild and refused to be intimidated. Quiet acts of defiance began to appear. Messages of support painted on bed sheets hung from windows facing away from the main street. Neighbors checked on each other, sharing food and offering comfort. A local mechanic started secretly fixing vehicles for free for people targeted by the vultures. Sheriff Miller found his phone ringing off the hook, not just with calls for help, but with people offering whatever assistance they could, information, places to hide witnesses, even just words of encouragement. They couldn't fight like Elara, or make arrests like the sheriff, but they could refuse to be broken. They could stand together. This resilience, this quiet solidarity, was the most powerful counterattack of all. It showed that the vultures hadn't just targeted individuals, they had attacked the very soul of the town, and the town was fighting back in its own way. Elara, observing this shift, felt a flicker of pride. This was why she was fighting. Not just for justice, but for the spirit of a community that refused to be extinguished. It reinforced her own resolve. The stakes were higher than ever. Rex was more dangerous than ever. But the town had found its courage. And Elara and her allies were ready to channel that courage into decisive action. The time for subtle disruption was ending. The time for the main confrontation was drawing near. Based on Elara's intelligence, gathered through daring close proximity surveillance, they now had confirmation of the drug operation. She had observed large shipments arriving and being processed, identified the types of drugs, and estimated the scale of the operation. This was more than enough for Sheriff Miller to contact state and federal authorities. Presenting the evidence Elara had risked her life to obtain, along with his own department's documentation of the vulture's reign of terror, he secured commitments for backup. However, federal agencies moved slowly. There would be a delay while they built their case and assembled their resources. Elara knew they couldn't wait. Rex, increasingly paranoid and cornered, was too dangerous. He might move the operation, go underground, or lash out with even greater violence against the town. They had to act now, using the initial plan, before the official forces were ready. The target was the warehouse, the heart of Rex's operation and his base of power. Elara's plan was audacious, they wouldn't wait for him to come out. They would draw him out, on their terms. "We hit him where he feels safest," Elara explained to Miller and Hanson in another late-night planning session. "The warehouse is his fortress. He's got his men there, he's got the drugs, the money. He thinks he's untouchable inside those walls. But how do we get him out?" Miller asked. "We make him think the fort is compromised, and his most valuable assets are at risk," Elara stated. "We know from my surveillance that he keeps a significant amount of cash and a large portion of the current drug shipment secured inside the warehouse, in a specific location." She pointed to a spot on her detailed sketch of the warehouse interior, drawn from memory after her reconnaissance. "We create a credible threat to that stash. Not enough to destroy it, but enough to make him believe it's about to be raided or destroyed." The bait. Elara detailed the tactic, a carefully timed, small-scale infiltration designed purely to make noise and appear to be targeting the cash and drugs, without actually engaging the full force of the vultures inside. This would trigger Rex's instinct to protect his assets or flee with them. "He's arrogant," Elara said. "He won't abandon his operation easily. He'll likely try to move the most valuable assets himself, or with a small, trusted group, away from the perceived threat at the warehouse. And we intercept him when he leaves, Deputy Hansen finished, seeing the trap. Exactly, Elara confirmed. This was where the Iron Sentinels came in. Elara had made the call. Ghost had answered immediately. Anything you need, Elara, he'd said, his voice rough but firm. You just say the word. We've got your back. Within 48 hours, Ghost and 12 members of the Iron Sentinels arrived discreetly in town, blending in as best they could, a large group of burly, serious-looking bikers. They set up camp in a secluded wooded area Elara knew, far from prying eyes. Ghost met with Elara, Miller, and Hansen. He was a man-mountain of quiet intensity, his eyes missing nothing. He listened intently as Elara explained the situation and the plan, occasionally asking sharp, relevant questions that showed his own strategic mind. His sentinels were gathered, briefed on the situation, a town terrorized by thugs, a veteran sister standing up. They were ready. Their presence boosted morale significantly. Miller and Hansen felt the weight of the world lift slightly knowing they had backup who knew what they were doing. The commitment among the allies solidified. This wasn't just about Elara anymore, it was about protecting a community, about veterans standing together, about law enforcement upholding justice where they could. Each person had their role, their skills. Elara, the strategist and infiltrator. Sheriff Miller and Deputy Hansen, the official link and local intelligence. The Iron Sentinels, the tactical muscle and backup. The townspeople, whose quiet resilience fueled their determination. The pieces were in place. The trap was set. All that remained was to spring it. Rex, inside the warehouse, felt the tension mounting. The minor disruptions, the arrests of his men outside of town, the constant feeling of being watched, it was getting to him. He yelled at his lieutenants, suspected treachery among his ranks, and relied more and more on the city enforcers, who were loyal only to the money he paid them and their own cold professionalism. He was a cornered animal, dangerous and unpredictable. He suspected the old woman was behind it, but he couldn't prove it, and his men were too afraid to get close to her farmhouse. He underestimated how close she already was. The major move had been bringing in the enforcers, signaling his shift from intimidation to outright elimination. This was his commitment to total control through overwhelming force. He was confident that with these professionals, he could crush any resistance, including the inexplicable old woman. He was walking right into Elara's plan. The plan was put into action on a night as black as pitch, the kind of night Elara felt most at home in. Phase 1, the infiltration and disruption bait. Elara, moving with the silence and speed of a predator, approached the warehouse perimeter from the least guarded side, using the dense woods and rough terrain as cover. She bypassed motion sensors and tripwires Rex had crudely installed, techniques that were amateurish compared to the security measures she was accustomed to dealing with. She slipped inside the warehouse through a high, unsecured window, dropping silently onto a stack of forgotten pallets. The air inside was thick with the smell of stale cigarettes, cheap cleaning products, and something else, something chemical and acrid, the drugs. She moved through the shadows, a phantom in the darkness, towards the area she'd identified as the location of the cash and drugs. She bypassed the few vultures on patrol, her movements invisible, her presence undetected. When she reached the room, she didn't attempt to steal anything. That wasn't the goal. Instead, she triggered a small, non-destructive smoke grenade with a timer, set a small, localized fire alarm to go off in 5 minutes, and placed a few strategically chosen items, a discarded piece of law enforcement gear she'd acquired years ago, a cheap burner phone playing a pre-recorded snippet of police radio chatter at low volume, near the stash. She wanted it to look like a rushed, amateurish raid by law enforcement, interrupted before they could grab the goods. Leaving no trace of her entry beyond the planned distractions, she exfiltrated the warehouse just as the timer expired and the alarm began to shriek, followed by the hiss of the smoke grenade. Chaos erupted inside. Yells, confusion, the stomping of boots. Rex, always paranoid about his money and product, immediately suspected a raid. His tactical instinct, limited as it was, told him to secure the most valuable assets. He gathered his core group of enforcers, the 5 city pros, and 2 of his most trusted vultures. They quickly loaded duffel bags filled with cash and packages of drugs into a waiting, nondescript van parked at the rear of the warehouse. This was exactly what Elara had anticipated. Rex took the bait. He wasn't fleeing, he was relocating, taking his valuable cargo to what he thought would be a safer location. He was moving from his fortified position into the open, where Elara and her allies were waiting. Phase 2, the interception. Sheriff Miller and Deputy Hanson, along with 2 other trusted deputies, were positioned in unmarked cars at key points leading away from the warehouse, maintaining discreet surveillance. They weren't close enough to be seen from the warehouse, but they monitored the roads Elara predicted Rex would take. The Iron Sentinels were stationed at the pre-planned interception point, a desolate stretch of highway several miles from town, where the road was flanked by dense woods on one side and a steep embankment on the other. There was no escape route here. They were waiting, bikes hidden in the trees, ready. Elara, after her exfiltration, made her way to the interception point, moving cross-country through the darkness with practiced ease. She was the linchpin, overseeing the operation. When Rex's van pulled out of the warehouse complex, Sheriff Miller spotted it. "They're moving," he radioed, his voice tense. He followed at a safe distance, relaying their location and estimated time to the interception point. The Iron Sentinels and Elara prepared. They set up a rolling roadblock, using 3 of the bikers positioned at staggered intervals down the road, ostensibly dealing with bike trouble. When Rex's van approached the first, broken-down, bike, the biker flagged him down. The van slowed, annoyed. As it did, the other 2 bikers converged, effectively boxing the van in. Rex, realizing it was a setup, roared in frustration. "Go! Go!" he yelled at the driver. The driver, one of the city enforcers, slammed the van into reverse, but it was too late. From the woods, the remaining Iron Sentinels emerged, silent and imposing. They weren't wearing colors, they looked like a force of nature, disciplined and formidable. Elara stepped out of the shadows, walking calmly towards the van, the hunting knife she had sharpened earlier held loosely at her side. Rex's eyes, visible through the van windshield, widened in disbelief and then pure terror as he recognized the old woman who had humiliated Spike. He hadn't brought enough men for this. He hadn't brought enough men for her. The confrontation was sharp and decisive. The city enforcers were skilled, but they were outnumbered and caught completely off guard by the professionalism of the Iron Sentinels and the terrifying aura of the old woman. The vultures with Rex were cannon fodder, quickly subdued by the sheer presence and controlled force of the bikers. The enforcers put up a fight, drawing weapons. But the Iron Sentinels moved with practiced efficiency, using non-lethal takedowns where possible, isolating and neutralizing each threat. Rex scrambled out of the van, leaving his cash and drugs behind, attempting to flee into the woods. He didn't get far. Elara moved with a speed that defied her age, intercepting him before he reached the tree line. Rex, seeing only an old woman, lunged at her, a desperate, clumsy attack. Elara didn't even look like she was trying hard. She dodged his wild swing, then, using his momentum, executed a perfect joint manipulation, bringing Rex to his knees with a cry of pain. She didn't hurt him unnecessarily. She simply controlled him, holding him steady as the Iron Sentinel secured the scene and rounded up his men. Sheriff Miller and Deputy Hanson arrived minutes later, sirens silent, lights off until they were sure the situation was contained. They saw the scene, Rex and his vultures subdued, the van secured, the Iron Sentinels standing watch like silent guardians. And Elara, the unassuming farmer, standing over the hulking figure of Rex, completely in control. Miller walked up to her, his face a mask of awe and relief. "It's done, Elara," he said. Elara nodded, her gaze still fixed on Rex, who was staring up at her with shattered arrogance and fear. "He took the bait," she said, her voice quiet. "And he underestimated the fishermen." The defeat of Rex and his core group was absolute. They were cuffed, secured, and the van with its illegal cargo was impounded. The city enforcers, cold and professional even in defeat, offered no resistance once they were neutralized. The warehouse was raided by Miller's department and state police backup, who arrived later that morning, uncovering the full extent of the drug operation and various other illegal activities. Evidence was collected, remaining vultures rounded up or scattered, their power base dismantled. The immediate aftermath was a mixture of stunned silence and palpable relief. News of Rex's capture and the vulture's downfall spread like wildfire through the town. People emerged cautiously from their homes, looking at each other with hesitant smiles. Sheriff Miller's office was flooded with calls, not of fear, but of gratitude. The Iron Sentinels, after ensuring the situation was stable and offering assistance to the sheriff's department, quietly packed up and rode out of town as discreetly as they had arrived, leaving only the memory of their silent strength. Elara returned to her farmhouse. The adrenaline began to fade, leaving her feeling the weariness of years settled deep in her bones. The quiet of her home was no longer a fragile piece, but a space earned, defended. Sheriff Miller visited her the next day, bringing coffee. He sat on her porch again, the air lighter this time, filled with the sounds of birds rather than the weight of fear. "We've got them, Elara," he said, a genuine smile on his face. "Rex, Spike, the city guys, they're all facing serious charges. The town is, well, it's breathing again." "Good," Elara replied simply, sipping her coffee. "It's thanks to you, Elara," Miller said, looking at her with profound respect. "You saved this town." Elara shook her head slightly. "The town saved itself, Sheriff. They found their courage. I just helped clear the path." She looked out at her fields, a contemplative expression on her face. "People like Rex, they thrive on fear. They think power comes from taking, from intimidating. But true strength, true respect, comes from protecting. From building, not destroying." It was a quiet thematic reflection, a distillation of a lifetime of hard-won lessons. She had fought for the idea that even in the face of overwhelming darkness, the light of courage and community could prevail. The vultures had underestimated her, seen only an old woman. They had underestimated the town, seen only timid victims. They hadn't understood that strength wasn't about how much fear you could instill, but how much courage you could draw upon, or inspire in others. They hadn't understood that the quietest people often carried the deepest reserves of strength. Elara had disturbed her peace to restore it for others, a duty she had thought was long past. But the need for justice, for protecting the innocent, didn't have a retirement age. The town began to heal. Businesses reopened, windows were repaired, the gas station and diner started the process of rebuilding with support from the community. The fear was gone, replaced by a quiet pride, a sense of having faced down a monster and won. Sheriff Miller, no longer overwhelmed, was able to focus on his duties, his department now seen as protectors, not just responders. He had learned valuable lessons about the hidden strengths within his community and the true nature of courage. Elara's profile didn't change in the public eye. Most people in town still saw her as the quiet farmer, perhaps with a new, grudging respect after hearing whispered accounts of her role in the vulture's downfall, attributing it to unexpected strength or a lucky break. But Sheriff Miller knew the truth. He carried the knowledge of who Elara truly was, a silent guardian, a veteran whose battle was never truly over as long as injustice existed. He understood the depth of gratitude the town owed her, even if they couldn't fully grasp the magnitude of her skills or past. He occasionally drove by her farmhouse, seeing her tending her garden, a peaceful figure in the landscape. The owner of the dog, arriving with tears in his eyes, the literal interpretation of the title, could manifest in a moment like this, Sheriff Miller, representing the grateful town, expressing his profound emotion. One afternoon, a few weeks after the dust had settled, Sheriff Miller stopped by Elara's farm, not on official business, but just to talk. He brought a small gift, a jar of local honey from a beekeeper whose hives the vultures had threatened. Elara accepted it with a simple thank you. They sat on the porch in comfortable silence for a moment. Then, Sheriff Miller, his voice thick with emotion, looked at her, his eyes glistening. "Elara," he said, I don't know how to thank you. What you did, for all of us, it was incredible. You risked everything. You didn't have to." He paused, struggling to find the words. "This town, these people, we were like that lost puppy, Elara. Scared, alone, freezing in the snow. And you found us. You brought us home." He reached out and placed a hand over hers, a gesture of deep, heartfelt gratitude. "Thank you," he repeated, the tears finally spilling onto his weathered cheeks. "Thank you for saving us." Elara met his gaze, a rare, genuine smile gracing her lips. She didn't need fanfare, or recognition. This moment, this quiet expression of profound relief and gratitude from a good man representing a grateful community, was all the reward she needed. The peace she had sought had been disrupted, but it had returned, stronger now, rooted in a town that had found its courage and a farmer who had remembered her strength. The fields around her farmhouse seemed greener, the sky bluer. Justice had been served, the innocent protected, and the quiet farmer could, perhaps, find a deeper peace now, knowing she had made a difference, one last, incredible time. The story of the quiet farmer who stood up to the vultures became a legend in the town, whispered in hushed tones. It was a story of unexpected heroism, of courage found in the most unlikely place. It was a reminder that you should never judge a book by its cover, or a hero by their age or appearance. And for Elara, tending her garden under the wide, blue sky, it was simply the reaffirmation that some things were worth fighting for, no matter how quiet the life you try to build. Tell us where you are watching from. If you are enjoying this story, remember to hit that subscribe button to join our community and not miss out on future stories like this one. Telling and preparing this story took us a lot of time, and your support means the world to us. We have special story for you tomorrow, stay tuned. The town, scarred but stronger, began to flourish. New businesses opened, inspired by the resilience shown. Sheriff Miller, with the vultures gone, was able to focus on community policing, working to keep the peace and prevent future problems. Deputy Hanson was promoted, her bravery recognized. The memory of the vultures served as a stark reminder of the darkness that could creep in, but also of the light that could push it back. Rex and his lieutenants faced lengthy prison sentences, their network dismantled by the combined efforts Elara had set in motion. The city enforcers were also put away, their professionalism no match for the consequences of their actions. Elara's farmhouse remained her sanctuary. She received occasional quiet visits from Sheriff Miller, updates on the town, shared moments of comfortable silence. She never sought recognition, content to live her life, her past battles now truly behind her, leaving a legacy of courage and justice in the town she had quietly adopted as her own. The simple acts of farming, the rhythm of the seasons, the taste of her homegrown tomatoes, these were the rewards, the peace she had fought for. And now, it felt permanent, earned through sacrifice and strength. She was just the quiet farmer again, but everyone who truly knew better. They knew she was a warrior, a guardian, a legend in overalls. And they knew that because of her, their town was safe. Up next you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.